Okay, so we've taken a look at strategy. We're moving on to the next really major component of the course, where we're looking at the different types of interorganizational relationships. But before we do that, I just want you to stop for a minute and think about the sport industry as an ecosystem. So that ecosystem, I mean, we often think about the environment, and I'm a scuba diver, so we'll throw up a picture of a turtle here on the Great Barrier Reef. But when we think about an ecosystem, we think about a series of symbiotic relationships between the various organisms that operate in that ecosystem. We think about the coordination and integration that happens between all of those different elements of the ecosystem. And each element of the ecosystem is providing a valuable resource to another element of the ecosystem. And again, this isn't in a negative way, right? These are all positive, that all of these relationships are benefiting the organization. And again, this ecosystem continually evolves and it grows. It's not static. It's a very dynamic system where new resources and or challenges are continually brought into that broader ecosystem that affect all of the organisms within the ecosystem. And then each organization is depending, or each element of the ecosystem is depending on the survival of others for its survival. So within that broader context, we're going to begin to break it down to look at how that ecosystem affects organizations. We're going to begin by looking at exchange relationships and partnerships. So on a continuum of relationships, from very, very weak relationships to strong, exchange relationships would be the weakest form of interaction between organizations. And I usually think of them as a one-off. Okay, so it's when you're making a purchase from an organization, there's no sense that you're ever going to make that purchase again. There's no trust, no loyalty, no sense that you might ever even meet that person again. The limitation or the area that we need to think about with an exchange is that price is going to be adversarial. So why is price adversarial? Because the seller, they want to get the highest price, and the buyer wants to get the lowest price. So there's that tension in these exchange relationships, right? So you're always trying to maybe get that bargain, and or if there are multiple suppliers of that particular resource that you need, you're going to be phoning around to find out who has the lowest price. And of course, that takes a lot of time. You're paying an employee to make those phone calls. So if you only need that resource once, the exchange relationship is the way to go, even though you're addressing somewhat of that tension, and it might take a little bit more time to gain access to that resource. So as we move along that continuum of strength of relationships, the next would be a partnership. And in a partnership, you're trying to overcome that adversarial nature of an exchange. So here, the idea is that it's an organization that you might be working with on an ongoing basis. So there might be a little bit of trust, a little bit of loyalty, and here you might be negotiating a little bit where you're going to purchase more of a product and guarantee that you're going to come back to purchase more of that product. And then the seller might say, well, either I'll give you more products for that price, or I'll give you a lower price for that product. So there's a little bit more of a negotiation because it's no longer a one-off. So here, price isn't necessarily the main dynamic within the relationship. It's this sense of continuity, because as the buyer, you're not having to chase suppliers all the time, right? You've got this supplier, it's a good supplier, they have quality products, and they're going to give you some type of a break on price, whether it's more product or actually a reduced price. So then this mutual agreement facilitates further interaction between these organizations. So it's fascinating to think that within the sport industry, many of the relationships in particular between broadcasters and sport organizations, and between corporate sponsors and sport properties. They were very much exchange relationships. And so here I'm talking about the 1950s, 60s, maybe into the 70s. We didn't really see a shift from exchanges to partnerships until the 1980s. And so I'm just going to give you a little bit of an example. And this whole idea of partnerships really started at the highest level of sport. So at the Olympic Games, most certainly the 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles. And I'll go into a little bit more details there. But in the context of pro sport, it was very driven by David Stern, who was the commissioner of the National Basketball Association. So these ideas began to come into the industry in the 1980s. But what's interesting is it took a long time for them to filter down to other areas of sport. So I'm just going to tell you a bit of a story. So this would have been maybe 2003, 2004. We had a number of interns that were working for the Ice Dogs when they were still in Mississauga. So that's how long ago it was. And they came to me and they said, Dr. Cousins, the Ice Dogs are really struggling to get, corporate partners. And of course, at this point in time, I had been reading about, the Olympics and what they were doing in terms of their the Olympic Partners Program, what David Stern was doing in terms of his relationships with corporate partners and broadcasters and his players, and very much this relationship philosophy that predominated those levels of sport. And so I said to the students, well, bring me their corporate partner package and, let me take a look at it and I'll, see what's going on. Anyway, so they brought it to me and it was one sheet of paper. So it wasn't a package. And so right away I'm a little bit surprised. And on this piece of paper, and we're going to throw it up on the screen so you could see it, it essentially listed different assets that the Ice Dogs had for sale. So in-ice advertising, scoreboard advertising, concourse advertising, rink board advertising, an ad in the program, etc. And it literally was one page. And then attached to each, item that was for sale was a price. So, maybe in-ice advertising or whatever is going to be $5,000. And this was this one page that they were giving out to the corporate partners. So this is very much what we described as an exchange relationship. A corporate partner's coming in, they're looking at this menu of different assets that they can purchase or not, and a static price that isn't negotiable. All right, so right away, I was a bit shocked that even though they were, a major junior team, right, so a professional sport organization, they hadn't adopted that partnership paradigm. They still were working very much on this exchange relationship where they had items to sell and corporate buyers could buy them or not. So a few years after my Mississauga Ice Dogs experience, I came across, it would have been about 5 or 6 years later, I came across the University of Michigan corporate partnership package. So right away, it's not for sponsors, it's for partners. And it was very much a package. So instead of one page with, a list of what was for sale and some prices, it was 29 pages that provided a detailed history and information about the U Michigan and really was a very engaging document that would entice corporate partners to come on board. So it had a history of the organization. It had a ton of demographic information. So what types of fans were watching the games on television, what types of fans are coming out to the games. So, and all the demographic information you can imagine, age, education, income, etc. They had a whole section on fandom, right? So what percentage of the fans purchased their merchandise, right? Were part of their fan club, etc. they listed all of the different properties that were available. So of course we're talking about a university athletics. So not only is it, of course the Ice Dogs were kind of limited to hockey, although they could have leveraged an association or a foundation, which they didn't do, right? So here they listed all of the different sports that were available, and again all of the different demographic information that was relevant, and all of the different media platforms that were available, and a list of like pages and pages of promotions. So in-game promotions, or having athletes come out to your your store. So if you're a corporation and you're seeking to expand your target market, enter into a new target market, reach out to a new demographic profile, introduce a new product, right? Then what it did was provide you with a constellation of information that you could draw from to tailor make your own package to achieve your goals. And of course the representatives from the university would sit down and say, what are the strategic objectives that you're trying to achieve? And then they would look at all of the information within the context of the package to then personally design the package that would best be fitted to achieving the strategic objectives of the corporate partner. I wish I could share the entire partnership plan with you, because I've used it as examples in numerous courses that I've taught at Brock. For copyright reasons I can't, but I have pulled out a couple of key diagrams from the plan that will give you an idea of the information, the demographic information that they would have provided to the corporate partners. And here, this is the integrated media platform. So this is a diagram of all of the different types of media that they can use to promote whatever it is the corporate partner's goals are. So it's a new product, whether you want to talk about that on the radio, whether you want to give it out to fans at the game, whether you want to highlight it on digital media, maybe have it on a television ad, maybe it's signage at a game, right? So they've got this whole constellation of different ways that you can achieve your goals that are shown in one snapshot, in one very concise diagram within the context of this 29-page package. So what caused that, like a really strategic jump from exchange relationships to partnerships? So part of it was the introduction of research looking at that sustained competitive advantage. There's a great article by Amos et al. That looks at sponsorship as a competitive advantage. And from that, theorists began to look at sport overall. And again, we saw examples from the Olympics. We saw what was happening with David Stern and the National Basketball Association. So I'm just going to share with you this quote that tries to explain how both the industry and theorists reconceived the relationships between sport organizations and their various partners within that ecosystem. So recent work highlighting the strategic value of sponsorship emphasized the need to look beyond the actual sport assets. And by assets, we mean the signage, luxury suite, athlete appearances, to what's actually offered to the corporate buyers, to include a consideration of the sustained competitive advantage available through long-term associations between the sport organizations and corporations. So we're going to take a few minutes and just talk a little bit about this change. So how was it that sport organizations evolved from this predominant view of exchange relationships to partnerships? So we've talked a little bit about how important strategy was, but there were critical factors as well. So sport organizations began to realize the value of proximal ties. So imagine every year if you had to go out and give that menu of assets to all of your corporate partners and re-sign them every single year, right? Well, what you want to do is sign up a partner for 5 years and then leverage those relationships relationships, evolve those relationships. And so we know about the marketing escalator, right? Well, this is really the same thing. You might bring in a partner, and maybe they're just going to, be part of your foundation, and maybe a rink board sponsorship. And then you're trying to leverage that up to the point where they're buying a luxury suite, right? And they have further integration with your organization. There was this realization of the mutual benefits. So the corporate part, so now we have the sport organization spending way more time enhancing their value to the corporate partner, but we saw the corporate partner realizing that they can achieve a lot more of their strategic goals through the sport organization that they originally thought of. So there's this mutual benefit, and the notion of that going on. Certainly we saw, of course, we always were aware of brands, but organizations became acutely aware that they wanted to be associated with certain brands of corporate partners. And of course, those would be the top brands, right? So, Fanta Orange versus Coke, right? Or what's the top credit card? What's the top, automobile, right? So they were looking at what those top brands were, and so organizations began to be sport. Instead of just having their hand out, right, saying please sponsor us, they began to be a little bit more selective because they wanted to have that elite association, right, to enhance the brand of their organization. And again, being part of that whole strategic context. So it wasn't just about money anymore and generating revenue from, selling rink boards. It was about this broader context of achieving their strategic goals in terms of growth, increasing their fan base, increasing the number of viewers that they had on television, and extending all of those relationships by using it. So for just one example, so when the Ice Dogs, they began, of course, to extend the types of relationships that they had with their partners, and they had like a Hershey Day. And so when you came in, the whole arena is branded Hershey, and everybody had free Hershey's chocolate bars on all of their seats, right? So it was small, but it was a difference from just purchasing a rink board, right? It was having this whole theme night around this sponsor. So these linkages became much stronger in terms of the number of assets and properties that were shared, the leveraging, the strategic planning that was done jointly between the organizations, and of course the length of the relationships. So if you are a corporate partner and you're investing more in that franchise, you're not just going to do that for a year. You're going to build that up over a number of years until you really dominate that marketplace, because you're working with one or potentially more sport organizations, within that city or in that region. Okay, so I've kind of hinted at this, but I'm going to take a few minutes and speak specifically about the other factors that contributed to the shift from the exchange relationships to the partnerships. And I'll speak about them distinctly, right, as sort of separate events that happened, but know that all of them were part of shifts in that sport ecosystem, that all were happening at the same time. Okay, so one of the primary shifts was the globalization of world markets. And so professional sport leagues, and of course the Olympic Games, they weren't just looking at sport within the context of North America anymore, right? Once we saw broadcasting, and certainly the onset of cable broadcasting globally, then sport organizations wanted to take advantage of that. So why be selling television commercials just in North America when you can broadcast your basketball games, your hockey games, football games on a global basis? So I would say the National Hockey League was also already global, really in the 1970s, 80s, right? Because of the nature of athlete recruitment. and certainly the types of tournaments that they would have had. But basketball, not so much. And they started to realize this, and they started having, in the off season, they'd have European tours wherever they'd take the athletes across Europe. They started having European leagues. They started investing in European basketball leagues. They started selling the merchandise for North American teams across Europe. And of course, they're doing that with all of their corporate partners, these global partners, and broadcasting. So globalization of markets was critical in terms of a real shift in the relationships. The next would be a change in that sport media complex that we spoke about earlier. So because of technological shifts, we saw a huge growth in broadcasting. So back in even the 1960s, so the shift happened when we had the deregulation of cable broadcasting in 1962. So in the US, prior to that time, we had really three major broadcasters: ABC, NBC, and CBS. So if you wanted to be on sport, you wanted to be a sport organization broadcast on television, then you had to go to one of those three broadcasters. In Canada, it would have been CBC, of course, and CTV. So when with the deregulation of broadcasting, we saw a plethora of cable companies emerge, like literally hundreds of cable companies. And I have some diagrams that I'll show to you. So many of these were sport-specific cable companies, like ESPN would be a really terrific example, in Sportsnet in Canada. And so over time, we not only saw the emergence of sport-specific cable, so all of these, sport fanatics can digest sport 24 hours a day, right? But we also saw competition. So the major networks now really needed to compete with these cable companies to get these sport contracts. So we saw the value of these sport contracts increase dramatically. Another key change in that sport media complex was an innovation by Pete Rozelle, who was the commissioner of the National Football League. And now that he realized that there were so many new buyers of the football product on television than just the three major broadcasting companies, he decided that football needed to sell its product as a single product. So instead of having every single franchise out selling its broadcast to local markets, what they wanted to do was essentially become a monopoly where their broadcasting product was concerned. Okay, so Pete Rozelle decided that they needed to change the legislation on the Competitions Act, so in the United States, so that they could then sell the broadcasting product as one single product instead of each team. So I read about this. So I bought this book from a historical bookstore when I was doing my PhD, and it's kind of funny because I think I paid an extra $30 for the cover, and it's got a big rip in it. But I think the book cost about $250 US, but it's unbelievably entertaining about all of the stories about the growth of the NFL, especially around the pivotal point when they were shifting their broadcasting contracts. Anyway, through lots of finagling, Pete Rozelle was able to gain this opportunity to sell football under one contract instead of having each franchise compete. And this, of course, enabled them to extort money from the broadcasting companies. And it completely changed the landscape of sport. So they went from selling their contracts from millions of dollars to billions of dollars. And it's interesting that the other leagues didn't necessarily follow suit. And you can kind of imagine that if you're a big market like LA, and then you've got the Green Bay Packers, right, that you're not really so happy if you're LA to put all of your broadcasting, together with these smaller teams. But Pete Rozelle was adamant that if they sold it together as one package, that they would be able to generate more money, which of course they did. So I'll set this my football Bible aside. Um, so other real changes were Ted Turner, also a Maverick, owner of the Braves, of course. But his idea was satellite television, and so he was the first ever professional sport team owner. And instead of worrying about all these broadcasting companies, he said, I'm going to have my own. Now, he already had a cable company, but he launched a satellite, and essentially people from all over North America could watch the Braves. And there's a lot of humor around it because in Alaska, where they clearly didn't have a baseball team or a basketball team, people would say, like, we're the Braves are the team of Alaska. Now, this infuriated the other baseball owners because he's generating all of this revenue from advertisers that he's not sharing with any of the other baseball owners. And again, very contentious, but Turner didn't really care, persisted on. But certainly the advent of satellite television and its value, and then setting up this whole idea of the superstation where you're owning multiple teams and you have your own broadcasting station, became really the pervasive model of success in broadcasting. 1984 Olympics, which I mentioned earlier, the creation of the TOPS program. So before 1984, you weren't allowed to have the commercialization of the Olympics. So you weren't allowed to sponsor athletes. So Peter Uberoth was the head of the LA Olympics, and he basically said, we're not going to lose money on our games. We're going to go full on in with corporate partners. He worked with Dick Pound, Canadian, give a shout out to Dick Pound, and they created the Olympic Partners program, which was first used in the LA Olympics, where they generated millions of dollars in corporate partner revenue, and also really extend this whole idea of partnerships. And of course, they have some partners, original partners like Coke and McDonald's, that remain partners today. David Stern, NBA, an absolute maverick. In terms of the whole notion of partnerships, not just with broadcasters, but certainly with corporate partners. And David Stern was very much the innovator. So if you look back to the NBA, we'd also had the American Basketball Association, these rival leagues. They're stealing each other's players. They've got terrible ratings. Their playoff games were not even broadcast in real-time television. So we can't even imagine that today. So David Stern wanted to reinvent the whole brand of the league, and in order to do that, he only wanted to partner with the top brands. So he would go through the different product areas, whether it's credit card, automobiles, banks, beverages, whatever, and he said to his people, we are only partnering with the top brands. Now, they're the worst league, right? So how audacious of David Stern to say that. But he said, we're never going to improve our brand if we're associated with these products that aren't necessarily the top products. So the top credit card at the time would have been American Express. We're only going to deal with American Express. And there's a story that Pepsi came to them and said, we want to be your corporate partner. And David Stern said, no, we're only dealing with Coke because they're the top brand. And then when they went to those partners, money was not the major essence. Again, would have been in the old exchange days, but in a partnership, they said to Coke, we want you to promote our athletes. We want NBA athletes to be on every Coke can in your local markets. So if it's in LA, we want the entire LA team to be on your Coke cans. And Coke said, great, because then people are going to collect these. They're going to want to have you, right? They can then leverage that. And so then it really extended from that. And then this whole idea of David Stern's that the arena, he said, we want our arenas to be like Disney, right? So you go to Disneyland and it's multiple sensations, experience, music, interactive, right? So he completely reinvented the stadium experience where we had, I remember, bungee jumpers coming down from the ceiling. We had dry ice all over the place. So the athletes were coming in these mist clouds. They had bands playing, they had music, no burgers and fries at NBA games. They had sushi and salads, right? So, and then this whole movement towards, this extending this business relationship right into the arena, luxury suites, right? So in the NBA, we're not going to use these old facilities, and we saw a huge growth of the building of new facilities, specifically around targeting these corporate buyers. So, you don't just want signage, you want your luxury suite and your corporate entertaining to be part of it. And it was very much David Stern that did that, and very much in partnership with the players. He was the first league to have a revenue sharing salary cap with the players. So the players were actually making more money than the owners. So, imagine that. So in hockey, we're never going to see that type of arrangement. All right, and so essentially, this culmination of these new ideas really enveloped the ecosystem of the league over about a 10-year time period to completely shift the nature of the relationships between sport organizations and partners. In conclusion, I'm going to share with you a couple of charts. The first chart shows you the very distinct differences between sponsorships and partnerships. The second chart really speaks to the managerial implications of moving from selling sponsors, right? Sponsorships, to this whole notion of as a manager within the context of the partnership paradigm. Thanks.